Keanu Reeves quietly walked into a luxury building with just a simple folder, no cameras, no attention. But within minutes, the receptionist rejected him like a nobody. What they didn't know was, his name was already inside their system. And when they finally checked it, the entire lobby went silent. Keanu arrived at the building just before late afternoon, at that quiet hour when the sunlight softens and the city begins to look more polished than it really is. The streets outside carried their usual rhythm, cars passing, distant voices, the hum of a life that never truly paused, but the building in front of him seemed untouched by all of it. It stood still, composed, almost detached, as if it existed in a different version of reality where everything was controlled, curated, and carefully selected. He didn't arrive in a luxury car. No driver stepped out to open his door. No one rushed forward to greet him. Instead, he walked up alone, dressed in simple dark clothing that fit well without trying to impress. His jacket was clean, his shoes worn but cared for, and in his hand, he carried a thin folder, organized, precise, the kind of folder someone brings when they expect to be evaluated, not recognized. There was nothing about him that demanded attention, and that was intentional. The building, however, demanded it on its own. The entrance was framed by tall glass doors that reflected the outside world just enough to blur it. Smooth stone surrounded them, flawless and polished in a way that suggested maintenance was constant and invisible. Two large planters stood on either side, holding greenery trimmed so perfectly it almost looked artificial. Every detail felt deliberate, as though nothing here was allowed to exist by accident. A doorman stood near the entrance, posture straight, expression neutral. His eyes moved subtly as Keanu approached, scanning him in a way that wasn't obvious but wasn't invisible either. It was the kind of look people give when they've been trained to assess quietly, to notice without reacting, to judge without showing it. Keanu stepped onto the polished entrance mat and paused for just a moment. It wasn't hesitation. It was something else. A quiet habit of awareness. He always paused before entering a new space, as if giving it time to reveal itself before he asked anything from it. Then he moved forward. Inside, the air shifted immediately. It was cooler, controlled, lightly scented with something clean and expensive, linen, wood, and something harder to name, something that suggested money without saying it directly. The lobby opened wide in front of him, spacious but not empty, designed to feel both welcoming and exclusive at the same time. The floors were polished marble, reflecting light in soft patterns that moved as people walked. The walls were a combination of stone and wood, layered in textures that looked effortless but clearly weren't. Along the sides, subtle lighting ran in clean lines, guiding the eye without demanding attention. Everything here had a purpose, even the silence. To the right, a small seating area held lounge chairs that looked more like sculptures than furniture. Behind them, a tall wall of decorative wood panels rose upward, each grain perfectly aligned as if nature itself had been edited. On the left, a long reception desk stretched across the space, topped with dark stone and minimal decoration. A small brass bell sat near the edge, beside a nameplate that simply read, "Reception," as if the building didn't need to explain anything further. Behind the desk stood a woman in a gray suit, her appearance neat and precise. Her hair was pulled back into a tight bun, and her posture matched the room, controlled, professional, composed. A tablet rested beside her keyboard, ready, organized, waiting. Her expression was pleasant, but not warm. It was the kind of expression designed to welcome and decline with the same tone. Keanu walked toward her at a steady pace. Not fast, not slow. There was no urgency in his movement, no attempt to command attention, but also no sign of hesitation. He moved like someone who didn't expect the world to adjust for him, but also didn't shrink from it. As he crossed the lobby, two residents nearby noticed him. An older man in a long coat glanced in his direction, his eyes lingering a second longer than necessary before looking away. A younger woman holding a small dog did the same, her gaze flickering with recognition before she quickly looked down, pretending to adjust the leash. Their reactions were subtle, controlled, but unmistakable. They recognized something, or thought they did, but weren't ready to admit it. Keanu noticed, of course. Not because he was looking for attention, but because attention is something you feel. It has a weight, even when it's quiet. But he didn't react. He didn't smile, didn't acknowledge it, didn't turn it into a moment. He simply kept walking. When he reached the desk, the receptionist looked up. Her eyes moved quickly, taking in details, the clothes, the shoes, the folder, processing information in seconds. It was a practiced evaluation, the kind that happens before a single word is spoken. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice smooth and measured. "Hi," Keanu replied calmly. "Good afternoon." He stood at a respectful distance, not leaning on the desk, not invading her space. Just present. Balanced. "I'm here about an apartment application," he continued, lifting the folder slightly, not pushing it forward, just indicating it. "I was told it would be reviewed today. I wanted to follow up in person." Her expression didn't change much, but something small shifted beneath it. A slight tightening. A subtle pause. As if this wasn't how things were usually done. "Of course," she said after a moment. "May I have your name?" "Keanu," he answered, then gave his full name clearly, calmly, like it was just another name among many. She turned to the screen and began typing. The soft clicking of keys filled the quiet space between them. For a few seconds, everything felt normal. Routine. Predictable. Keanu waited without impatience. He didn't check his phone. Didn't shift his weight. Didn't fill the silence with unnecessary words. Instead, he observed. The cameras placed carefully around the lobby. The symmetry of the furniture. The way everything was aligned just enough to suggest control without appearing rigid. Then the receptionist paused. It was small. Almost invisible. Her fingers slowed, then stopped. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she looked at the screen again. She typed once more, slower this time, then clicked into something else. "One moment," she said. Keanu nodded. Sure. But something had already changed. The air in the lobby felt different now. Not visibly, not dramatically, but enough. And without saying it out loud, Keanu knew. This wasn't going to be as simple as it should have been. The receptionist's fingers moved again, slower this time, as if the system beneath her hands had stopped behaving like something familiar. The soft clicking of the keyboard that usually blended into the background now felt deliberate, almost hesitant. Her eyes shifted between the screen and the notes she had already pulled up, then back again, as though she was trying to confirm that what she was seeing wasn't a mistake. Keanu remained still. Not frozen, not tense, just present. He had learned long ago that moments like this don't need interference. They reveal themselves on their own. So he waited, holding his folder lightly at his side, his posture steady, his expression calm. The receptionist leaned slightly closer to the monitor. Her professional composure didn't break, but it began to strain at the edges. A small crease formed between her brows, subtle enough that most people wouldn't notice, but in a place like this, where everything was designed to look effortless, it stood out. "One moment," she repeated quietly, more to herself than to him. Keanu gave a slight nod. Sure. Behind her, the lobby continued its quiet performance of luxury. Soft lighting reflected off polished marble floors. The faint scent in the air remained unchanged. A resident walked past toward the elevators, glancing briefly in their direction before looking away again, as if unwilling to acknowledge anything that might disrupt the building's carefully maintained neutrality. But something had already shifted at the desk. The receptionist clicked into another screen. Then another. Her movements were no longer smooth. They were searching now. Checking. Verifying. The rhythm of her work had changed from routine to investigation. Her expression tightened. Not fear yet, but uncertainty. Keanu noticed the change, of course. He didn't react outwardly, but his awareness sharpened slightly. Not because he expected trouble, but because he recognized when systems stop behaving mechanically and start behaving emotionally through the people operating them. Behind the desk, she stopped typing completely. For a second, the only sound was the distant hum of the building's air system. Then she spoke again. "May I confirm your full name once more?" she asked, her voice still polite, but quieter now. Keanu repeated it without hesitation. "Calm. Clear." She typed again. This time, she didn't stop. A few seconds passed. Then her posture changed. It was subtle at first, a small shift in her shoulders, a tightening in her jaw, but it carried weight. The kind of weight that comes when a system returns information that wasn't expected. Her eyes moved across the screen more slowly now. Line by line. Reading something beyond the standard application fields. Then she paused. Keanu saw it instantly. The pause wasn't professional. It wasn't procedural. It was realization. Behind her, the glass reflection of the lobby showed faint movement. The older man who had been near the seating area had slowed slightly, now pretending to adjust his coat while watching the desk. The younger woman with the dog had stopped completely, her attention subtly drawn back. Attention was spreading. Not loud. Not obvious. But present. The receptionist swallowed. It was small, but visible. She leaned closer again, as if proximity to the screen might change what it said. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard but didn't move. Then she spoke, but this time her voice had lost its certainty. "I need to check something with my supervisor," she said. Keanu nodded once. "Take your time." He didn't ask what she saw. He didn't push. He didn't lean forward. He simply stayed where he was, as if the moment belonged entirely to the system now, not to him. The receptionist turned slightly in her chair and glanced toward the office behind the desk. Her eyes carried something different now. Not just confusion, but urgency. She stood. "I'll just be a moment," she said quickly, then stepped away from the desk. As she walked, her pace was controlled, but faster than before. The professionalism was still there, but now it was layered over something else, concern, maybe even alarm. Keanu remained at the counter alone. The space around him felt subtly larger now. Not physically, but socially. As if the room had widened its distance from him without moving at all. He shifted his gaze briefly across the lobby again. The symmetry. The silence. The controlled elegance. It all looked the same. But it didn't feel the same anymore. Moments later, the receptionist returned, but not alone. A man followed her. He wore a tailored suit, darker than the lobby's neutral tones, his posture straight, his expression carefully composed. He moved with the quiet authority of someone used to being obeyed without question. The apartment manager. He approached the desk and didn't look at Keanu immediately. First, he looked at the receptionist's screen. Then at her face. Then finally, he turned his attention forward. To Keanu. His eyes paused. Not recognition at first, evaluation. The kind that measures people quickly, threat, importance, inconvenience, value. Then something shifted. A flicker. A delay in understanding, because somewhere in that brief moment of assessment, the name on the file connected with something larger than expected. "Mr. Reeves," the manager said finally, his tone controlled but slightly adjusted. Not warmer. Not colder. Just different. Keanu gave a slight nod. Yes. The manager's eyes held on him a fraction longer than before. Then he looked back at the screen again, as if confirming something that shouldn't require confirmation. The receptionist stood slightly behind him, hands clasped tightly together now. The manager exhaled softly through his nose. "I understand you're here regarding an application," he said. Keanu responded evenly. "Yes. I was told it was under review. A brief silence followed. Not empty this time. Heavy. The manager glanced once toward the receptionist, then back to the screen. His jaw tightened slightly, almost imperceptibly. We may need to review this internally, he said carefully. Keanu didn't react to the wording. He had expected variations of it already. Instead, he simply said, it was already reviewed. That sentence lingered. The receptionist looked down immediately. The manager didn't respond right away. Because there was no easy way to answer it without acknowledging what had already happened. A decision had been made. Quietly. Confidently. And now that decision had been interrupted by information that changed its context entirely. The manager finally spoke again, softer this time. Please give us a moment. Keanu nodded once. Of course. And he waited. But now, the waiting felt different. Because something in the building had started to shift, not physically, but structurally. And everyone at that desk could feel it. Even if no one said it out loud. The manager didn't move for a few seconds. Not because he was unsure how to act, but because he was recalculating how the situation was supposed to be understood. His posture remained controlled, shoulders squared, hands loosely joined in front of him, but his attention was no longer on routine procedure. It was on the screen behind the receptionist. Keanu stayed still at the counter. No pressure. No insistence. Just presence. And that presence was becoming harder for the room to ignore. The receptionist stood slightly behind the manager now, as if instinctively stepping out of responsibility and into observation. Her earlier confidence in the system had already weakened. Now it felt like she was watching the system respond to something it wasn't designed to handle smoothly. The manager finally exhaled. Slowly. I see, he said, though it didn't sound like understanding. It sounded like adjustment. He turned slightly toward the receptionist. Open the full application file. She hesitated for half a second before typing again. The keyboard clicked softly, but now each sound felt amplified in the silence between them. The screen changed, shifting from a simple status view to a deeper internal record. Keanu didn't move closer. He didn't try to see. He didn't need to. He could already sense the direction this was going. The manager's eyes scanned the screen carefully. Line by line. His expression remained controlled, but something behind it had changed. The certainty he walked in with was no longer intact. It had fractured into caution. Behind them, the lobby continued its quiet performance. A resident passed through the far end, slowing slightly as they noticed the unusual stillness at the reception desk. Then, as most people in places like this do when they sense something unclear, they continued walking without asking questions. The manager spoke again, quieter now. There appears to be a secondary note attached to this application, he said. The receptionist looked down immediately, as if avoiding ownership of the words. Keanu finally shifted his gaze slightly toward them. Not urgently. Just enough to acknowledge the change. And what does it say? He asked. The question was calm. Almost gentle. But it carried weight because it didn't assume anything. It only asked for truth. The manager didn't answer right away. He read again. Then again. His jaw tightened slightly. It indicates, he began carefully, a potential connection to an affiliated ownership structure. The words hung in the air like something unfinished. Keanu didn't react outwardly. But something in the room subtly changed. Because now the rejection that had seemed simple a few minutes ago was no longer simple. It was layered. Reevaluated. Rewritten in real time by the system that had originally ignored him. The receptionist looked at the manager, then at the screen, then quickly away again. Her hands were no longer on the keyboard. They were still. The manager continued, slower now. Here, It suggests that your name is linked indirectly to the building's parent organization. Silence followed. Not empty silence. The kind of silence that carries correction inside it. Keanu nodded once, almost imperceptibly. Not satisfaction. Not surprise. Just recognition. I see, he said quietly. The manager looked up at him now more directly than before. The evaluation in his eyes had shifted again. Not curiosity this time, but caution mixed with discomfort, because the hierarchy in the room had become unclear, and unclear hierarchies make people uneasy. The receptionist finally spoke, her voice smaller than before. We weren't aware of this when the initial decision was made, she said quickly, as if trying to separate herself from responsibility. Keanu turned slightly toward her. Not in judgment. Just acknowledgement. That's understandable, he said. And that response, simple and controlled, somehow made the situation heavier, not lighter. Because it didn't accuse anyone. It just exposed what had already happened. The manager cleared his throat. We would normally escalate this kind of file for higher-level review, he said carefully. Keanu nodded slightly. Then escalated, he replied. No anger. No pressure. Just direction. The manager hesitated. Not because he disagreed. Because now every action had consequence attached to it. He looked at the receptionist briefly, then back at Keanu. We will need to verify this information with the ownership office, he said. Keanu answered without delay, please do. The receptionist reached for the phone almost too quickly, as if movement could restore order. She dialed, her fingers slightly unsteady now, and turned slightly away while the line connected. The manager remained facing forward, but his composure had shifted. It was still professional, but no longer confident in the same way. Now it was careful. Measured. Aware. Keanu stood in the same position he had been in since he arrived. Same posture. Same calm. But the room around him had changed. And that change was no longer subtle. It was visible in how people moved, how they spoke, how they paused before speaking again. The receptionist spoke into the phone quietly, giving details, confirming names, repeating information that now sounded more important than it had an hour ago. Her voice was controlled, but thinner than before. The manager stepped slightly aside, glancing once toward the entrance of the lobby, then back again, as if checking whether the building itself had started paying attention. Keanu didn't look at either of them. He looked at the space instead. At how quickly certainty had turned into review. At how easily rejection had become reconsideration. And not because anything about him had changed, but because the system had finally been forced to look deeper than surface assumptions. The receptionist ended the call and placed the phone down carefully. They're reviewing it now, she said. The manager nodded slowly, as if absorbing instructions from somewhere above his current authority level. Understood, he replied. And then, for the first time since Keanu walked in, no one immediately tried to control the outcome. They simply waited. All three of them. In a lobby designed to look like certainty. But now filled with something far less stable. Uncertainty. And beneath it, truth, finally starting to surface. The waiting didn't feel like waiting anymore. It felt like the building itself had paused, not out of peace, but out of uncertainty. The kind of silence that happens when a system realizes it is being forced to look at itself. Keanu remained where he was. Same posture. Same calm, same quiet control over his own presence. Nothing about him changed, but everything around him was no longer behaving the same way it had when he walked in. The receptionist stood near the phone, her eyes now fixed on the screen again as if the call had left behind something heavier than instructions. The manager stayed beside the desk, hands no longer behind his back but loosely at his sides, a subtle shift that revealed he was no longer performing authority in the same way. The lobby itself still looked perfect. That was the strange part. The marble still reflected the soft lights. The air still carried its clean, expensive scent. The furniture still sat in precise alignment. But now, none of it felt neutral anymore. It felt watched. Like even the design had become part of the conversation. Keanu finally shifted his gaze slightly, not toward them, but toward the space beyond the desk. Toward the building's deeper structure. The elevators. The hallways. The unseen offices behind the polished walls. He wasn't looking for answers anymore. He was watching behavior. The receptionist broke the silence first, quietly. "They confirmed receipt," she said, almost like she didn't want the words to exist outside the phone call. The manager nodded once. And? She hesitated. That hesitation said more than the answer itself. Then she spoke again, softer. "They said the file should not have been declined without escalation." The words landed gently, but they changed the air immediately. Not loudly. Just enough. The manager's jaw tightened. Keanu didn't react outwardly, but internally, the structure of what had happened earlier became even clearer. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a decision made too quickly, without proper alignment with the system that was supposed to govern it. And now that system was correcting itself. Slowly. Uncomfortably. The manager exhaled through his nose, looking at the screen again as if it had started to speak a different language. "We followed internal screening guidelines," he said carefully, not defensive, but not fully open either. Keanu turned his head slightly toward him. "That's not what I'm asking," he said calmly. The manager paused. Keanu continued, voice steady. "I'm asking why the first answer was no." Silence followed. Not because no one heard him. Because answering required honesty that didn't sit comfortably inside procedure. The receptionist lowered her gaze again. The manager's eyes flicked briefly toward the lobby entrance, then back to Keanu. And for a moment, it looked like he might fall back into policy again. But he didn't. Instead, he said something simpler. "Because it was assumed you would bring attention." The truth was now in the room. Unfiltered. Keanu nodded slightly, as if confirming something he already understood. "So the assumption came first," he said quietly. "And the review came after." The manager didn't respond. Because there was no correction available that didn't sound like justification. The receptionist shifted slightly, uncomfortable now not with Keanu, but with the clarity forming around the situation. Keanu looked at her briefly. Not to pressure her. Just to acknowledge her presence in it. Then he looked back at the manager. "I didn't come here to disrupt anything," he said. "I came here because I wanted to be treated like any other applicant." His voice stayed calm, but something in it sharpened, not aggression, but precision. "And I wasn't." The words were simple. But they carried weight because they didn't accuse. They described. The manager swallowed once. The building's soft ambient music continued playing in the background, almost inappropriate now. Too smooth. Too indifferent. Like it hadn't noticed the shift in meaning happening at the front desk. The receptionist spoke again, almost automatically. "They are asking for a full internal review log," she said. That sentence changed the manager's posture slightly. Not dramatically. But enough. Because now it wasn't just about an application. It was about traceability. Keanu noticed that shift immediately. The moment decisions stop being abstract and start becoming documented, behavior changes. He stayed quiet, letting the system continue revealing itself without interruption. The manager finally spoke again. "We can escalate this to the executive review channel," he said. Keanu nodded once. "That would be appropriate," he replied. No emotion attached. Just alignment with process. And that lack of emotional reaction made the situation even more uncomfortable for the manager, because it removed the tension he could have responded to. There was nothing to fight. Nothing to defend against. Only structure being examined. The receptionist printed something quietly. The sound of paper coming out of the machine felt louder than it should have. Like the building was producing evidence. She placed the document on the desk carefully. Neither rushed nor confident anymore. Just careful. The manager glanced at it, then at Keanu. "This will take some time," he said. Keanu nodded. "I understand," he replied. And then something subtle changed again, because now, the urgency was no longer about correcting a rejection. It was about managing perception. The manager straightened slightly, as if trying to regain some sense of professional control. "Mr. Reeves," he said carefully, "we value discretion and privacy here." Keanu looked at him for a moment. Then replied gently, "So do I." That simple line shifted the tone again, because it revealed the contradiction. If both sides valued privacy, the rejection should never have been based on assumptions about attention in the first place. The receptionist looked down again, visibly uncomfortable now. The manager didn't respond immediately. Instead, he nodded slowly, as if absorbing the contradiction without being able to resolve it in real time. Keanu remained still. Not waiting for approval. Not waiting for apology. Just observing the system settle into its corrected state. And for the first time since he entered the building, the conversation wasn't about whether he belonged. It was about why that question had been answered so quickly in the first place. And that realization lingered in the room longer than any spoken sentence. The executive call didn't arrive with drama. It came quietly. A vibration. A glance. A shift in posture that only the receptionist noticed first. She picked up the phone with slightly trembling fingers, her earlier confidence completely gone now, replaced by careful attention to every word she might say. The manager watched her without speaking. Keanu remained still at the counter. Not involved in the mechanics of the call, but fully aware of its weight. Because in places like this, nothing just happens. Every call is a chain moving upward through layers of authority. The receptionist spoke softly into the phone, confirming names, repeating identifiers, adjusting her tone the way people do when they know they are no longer speaking to someone equal in authority. Yes, he is here in person," she said, glancing briefly at Keanu before looking away again. The manager's jaw tightened slightly. Not fear yet, but awareness. The kind that comes when a situation stops being local and starts becoming institutional. Keanu didn't move. He didn't look toward the phone. He didn't try to anticipate the outcome. He simply stood there in the same position he had occupied since arriving, calm, grow. Unchanged. The only thing shifting now was the room's relationship to him. The receptionist nodded repeatedly into the phone. "Yes. I understand. I will relay that." Then silence on her side. She listened longer this time. Her expression changed subtly as she absorbed instructions that were no longer about routine handling. Her eyes flicked up once, briefly, toward the manager, then back down again. When she finally hung up, she placed the phone down carefully, as if even sound now mattered. The manager spoke first. "What did they say?" His voice was controlled, but slightly lower than before. The receptionist hesitated. That hesitation again. It had become the most honest thing in the room. "They want the application paused," she said quietly. The manager blinked once. "Paused?" he repeated. She nodded. "And reviewed under executive oversight." The word executive changed the air instantly. Not loudly, but structurally. Because it meant the decision was no longer theirs in any practical sense. Keanu finally shifted his gaze slightly, not to them, but to the space ahead. The lobby, the entrance, the controlled world behind glass. The system had stepped in. The manager exhaled slowly through his nose, trying to maintain composure, but something in his stance loosened. The illusion of local authority had cracked. He turned slightly toward Keanu. "This is becoming elevated beyond standard intake," he said carefully. Keanu looked at him now. Not sharply. Not coldly. Just directly. "That already happened when you declined it," he said. The manager didn't respond immediately. Because that was the truth no one in the room could escape. The receptionist looked down again, uncomfortable in a way that had nothing to do with her job anymore. It was moral discomfort now. The kind that lingers when procedure and fairness stop matching. Keanu continued, voice steady. "I didn't ask for escalation," he said. "I asked for consistency." The manager nodded slowly, but it was more acknowledgement than agreement. The silence that followed was heavier than before. Because now the situation had moved past correction. It was entering reflection. And institutions don't like reflection when it exposes process. The receptionist spoke quietly. "They are asking for all previous notes and timestamps," she said. The manager closed his eyes briefly, not in frustration, but in calculation. Because he knew what that meant. Traceability. Accountability. Sequence. Keanu noticed that shift clearly. Not because he was looking for weakness, but because he understood systems. When people start checking timelines, they are no longer deciding outcomes. They are reconstructing decisions. The manager finally spoke again. "We followed standard discretion protocols," he said, more carefully now. Keanu nodded once. "And standard discretion included declining without proper review?" he asked. The question wasn't aggressive. It was structural. The manager paused. Because that question exposed the gap between policy and practice. The receptionist remained silent, hands now resting still on the desk. No typing. No movement. Just observation. The manager answered finally, quieter. "In this case, yes." The honesty cost him something. It showed in his posture. Keanu didn't react emotionally. He simply acknowledged it. "Then the issue isn't the application," he said. "It's the process." No one responded. Because no one could disagree without defending something that was no longer defensible. A resident passed behind them toward the elevators. Slower than usual. They had sensed something unusual in the lobby. People always do. But they kept walking anyway. Because most people choose distance over understanding. The receptionist broke the silence softly. "They are sending instructions," she said. The manager nodded. "From executive office?" "Yes." A pause. Then she continued. "They are requesting immediate reassessment and documentation of the initial rejection rationale." That sentence landed heavily. Because it meant one thing. The decision was now being reviewed by the same structure that empowered it. The manager straightened slightly again, but this time it felt less like authority and more like adjustment to oversight. He looked at Keanu. "We will comply," he said. Keanu nodded. "That's all I asked." But he didn't sound satisfied. And that mattered, because satisfaction implies resolution. And this wasn't resolution. It was exposure. The receptionist printed another document. This one longer. Heavier in meaning, even if physically just paper. She placed it on the desk and stepped back slightly, as if distancing herself from what it represented. The manager looked at it but didn't pick it up immediately. Instead, he spoke more quietly. "Mr. Reeves," he said, "this situation has created internal review escalation." Keanu responded calmly. "It didn't need to," he said, and that sentence hung in the air without needing expansion. Because everyone in the room knew what caused it. Not Keanu's presence. But the building's reaction to his presence. The manager finally picked up the document. scanned it briefly, then placed it back down. His expression had changed again, not fear now, but resignation mixed with understanding. Because the system was no longer protecting a decision. It was analyzing it. He looked at Keanu. And for the first time, his tone softened slightly. "We will ensure fairness going forward," he said. Keanu held his gaze for a moment. Then replied simply, "That's the only direction that matters." And the room went quiet again. But this time, the silence wasn't tension. It was transition. Something in the building had already begun to change. And everyone could feel it, even if no one said it out loud. The silence that followed didn't feel empty anymore. It felt structured. Like the room had entered a different phase of itself, one where every word had already been recorded somewhere beyond the lobby, even if no one had said it aloud. Keanu stood in the same place, but the atmosphere around him had shifted again. Not dramatically. Not visibly. But in the subtle way people change how they breathe when they know they are being evaluated from above. The receptionist stayed behind the desk, hands resting now instead of moving. Her earlier urgency had been replaced with controlled stillness. She had done what she could at her level, and now the situation belonged to something larger than her. The manager held the document, but he wasn't reading it anymore. He was thinking through it, as if the words had stopped being text and started becoming consequence. Keanu didn't break the silence. Because silence, in moments like this, wasn't absence. It was information. A resident in the background slowed near the seating area again, not stopping fully, but enough to notice the shift in tone. People always feel when authority changes shape, even if they can't explain why. The lobby still looked perfect. Still expensive. Still controlled. But now it felt like a stage where something real had interrupted the performance. The manager finally spoke again, but his voice was different now. Less procedural. More human. "We've received instructions from the executive office," he said. The receptionist glanced up immediately, then back down. Keanu nodded slightly. "Go ahead." The manager exhaled. "They want the initial decision reviewed in full context," he said. "Including the reasoning, the timing, and the absence of escalation." The words were careful. Each one chosen like it had consequences attached to it. Keanu absorbed them without reaction. Then he said quietly, "That means someone is finally asking why it happened." The manager didn't respond immediately. Because that was exactly what it meant. And it was uncomfortable to admit. The receptionist spoke softly, almost hesitant. "They also requested confirmation of who authorized the initial decline," she said. The manager's jaw tightened slightly. Not in anger. In recognition. Because now responsibility was no longer abstract. It had a direction. Keanu watched them both, not with judgment, but with clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when systems stop hiding behind layers and begin exposing their actual decision points. He spoke calmly. "I didn't come here to force this," he said. "I came here to understand it." The manager nodded slowly. "And now you do," he replied, but there was no confidence in it anymore. Only acknowledgement. Keanu didn't answer immediately. Because understanding and acceptance were not the same thing. The receptionist shifted slightly behind the desk, then finally spoke again. "Sir," she said quietly, addressing Keanu now instead of the manager, "we were only informed that applications with potential public visibility concerns should be reviewed cautiously." Her voice wasn't defensive. It was careful. Almost apologetic. Keanu looked at her. Not sharply. Not coldly. Just directly. "And who defines public visibility concern?" he asked. The question wasn't aggressive. It was foundational. And it landed heavily because there was no simple answer that didn't reveal bias. The receptionist hesitated. The manager answered instead. It is assessed at intake level based on profile indicators, he said. Keanu nodded slowly. So interpretation replaces inquiry, he said quietly. No one responded. Because that was exactly what had happened. A short silence followed. Not tense now. Reflective. The kind of silence that forms when people realize the structure they trust is more subjective than they believed. The receptionist lowered her gaze again, but not out of avoidance this time. Out of discomfort, because she could now see the gap between policy and human impact. The manager placed the document down fully this time, as if letting go of it physically would help him think more clearly. He spoke again, quieter. This situation will be reviewed at a higher level, he said. And corrected if necessary. Keanu nodded. That's expected, he replied. But his tone wasn't demanding. It was simply factual. Because from his perspective, correction was not an exception. It was the baseline. A resident walked past again, slower this time, clearly aware that something unusual was happening but still choosing not to engage. The kind of quiet avoidance that luxury environments often encourage, observe, but don't interrupt. The manager finally looked at Keanu more directly. And for the first time, there was no evaluation in his gaze. Only recognition of imbalance. We did not handle this correctly at initial stage, he admitted. The words were simple. But they carried weight because they were no longer filtered through procedure. The receptionist's eyes widened slightly, not at the admission itself, but at how easily it came once it finally came. Keanu gave a small nod. I agree, he said. No satisfaction. No emphasis. Just alignment. The manager continued, slower now. And I understand why that matters beyond this application. That sentence shifted the air again. Because it moved the conversation from correction to consequence. Keanu held his gaze for a moment. Then said gently, it always mattered. The manager didn't respond immediately. Because there was nothing to add to that without sounding like explanation rather than understanding. The receptionist finally spoke again, softer than before. I'm sorry, she said. And this time it wasn't procedural. It wasn't required. It was personal recognition. Keanu looked at her briefly. Then nodded once. I know, he said quietly. And that was enough. The silence that followed wasn't heavy anymore. It was different. Less defensive. More aware. The manager stepped slightly back from the desk, as if the physical space itself had changed meaning. We will escalate this immediately, he said. Keanu nodded. Do that, he replied. But then he added something else, softer. And make sure it's documented properly this time. The manager hesitated. Then nodded. We will. Keanu finally adjusted his stance slightly, not leaving yet, but no longer anchored to the counter in the same way. Because the situation had moved beyond confrontation. It had entered resolution processing. And he didn't need to stay in the center of it anymore to understand it. The receptionist watched him carefully now, as if trying to reconcile the man standing in front of her with the assumptions the system had made earlier. The manager spoke one last time in this moment. Mr. Reeves, he said, we appreciate your patience. Keanu looked at him. And replied simply, it wasn't patience, he said. It was clarity. And with that, the tone in the room shifted one final time. Not because everything was fixed. But because everyone now understood that what had happened here was no longer invisible. It had been seen. And once something is seen clearly, it cannot return to being what it was before. The executive response didn't arrive with urgency anymore. It arrived with structure. A calm, formal instruction transmitted through the chain that now had no choice but to treat the situation as something documented, traceable, and real. The kind of reality institutions cannot ignore once it enters their internal record systems. At the reception desk, the manager read the message twice, not because he didn't understand it, but because understanding it meant accepting what it implied. The receptionist stood slightly behind him, hands now still, watching his expression rather than the screen. She no longer tried to anticipate outcomes. That stage had passed. Now she was only observing consequences unfold in real time. Keanu remained where he had been since the beginning of this escalation. Calm. Grounded. Unmoved in posture, but fully aware of every shift in tone around him. The manager finally spoke, voice quieter than before. The executive office has confirmed immediate re-evaluation under formal oversight, he said. The words were precise, but they no longer carried authority. They carried confirmation. Keanu nodded once. Good, he said simply. Not approval. Just acknowledgement that the process had finally aligned with its own stated standards. A silence followed. But it was no longer the same silence from earlier. Earlier, silence had been defensive. Now it was procedural.
The receptionist glanced toward the screen again, then away. Her movements were slower now, as if the system she once operated confidently had become something she was no longer fully inside. The manager exhaled lightly and adjusted his stance. There will need to be a formal review of the initial decline decision, he said. Including identification of the reasoning applied at intake level. Keanu listened without interrupting. Then asked gently, and who will review it? The manager hesitated for a fraction of a second. Executive Compliance Team, he said. Keanu nodded again. That answer mattered more than it sounded. Because it meant the decision had moved beyond local interpretation entirely. Now it was being examined by structure above personality. The receptionist spoke quietly, almost to herself. That includes audit logging, she said. The manager didn't correct her. Because she was right. Keanu turned his head slightly toward her. Not sharply. Just enough to acknowledge her presence in the conversation. And that means the record will show everything? He asked. The receptionist nodded. Yes, she said softly. A pause. Then she added, almost reluctantly, every action. That sentence changed the atmosphere again. Not dramatically. But decisively. Because now nothing in the process was invisible anymore. The manager placed both hands on the edge of the desk, steadying himself in a way that wasn't physical necessity but psychological recalibration. He spoke again, slower. We are required to ensure transparency moving forward, he said. Keanu looked at him for a moment. Then replied, you were always required to do that. The manager didn't respond. Because there was no procedural defense that could soften that truth. The receptionist lowered her gaze again, not out of fear now, but recognition. The system had not failed in silence. It had failed in sequence. And sequence leaves evidence. A resident in the distance paused near the seating area again. This time longer than before. The shift in energy was no longer subtle enough to ignore. Even people who didn't know the details could feel the difference between normal lobby behavior and something being actively reprocessed. Keanu noticed, but didn't react. He had stopped performing for observers long ago. The manager finally spoke again. We will need confirmation from ownership authorization logs as well, he said. Keanu nodded. Then retrieve them, he replied. Simple. Direct. No escalation in tone. And that made the instruction harder to resist than any demand could have been. The receptionist moved slightly, preparing another system access request, but paused briefly before typing. Her hesitation was no longer confusion. It was awareness. She had started to understand the scale of what she was touching. The manager noticed and spoke more gently this time. Proceed, he said. She nodded and began typing again. The soft sound of keys returned to the space, but now it felt different. Less like routine work. More like documentation of a correction process already in motion. Keanu watched them without pressure. Not evaluating them. Not guiding them. Just observing how systems respond when forced to align with their own rules. The manager spoke again after a moment. Because it was accurate. And accuracy, in institutional environments, is harder to dismiss than emotion. The receptionist stopped typing briefly and looked at the screen. Then at the manager. Then at Keanu. Her voice came out quieter than before. "It's all being recorded now," she said. Keanu nodded once. "Good," he said again. But this time, it wasn't about agreement. It was about closure of invisibility. The manager stepped slightly back from the desk, as if the physical space between them now represented something more formal than before. "We will ensure full compliance with the review directive," he said. Keanu responded without hesitation. "That's expected." No anger. No satisfaction. Just alignment with how the system should have functioned from the beginning. The receptionist looked at Keanu again, her expression now softer than before. Less professional distance. More human awareness. And for the first time, the building didn't feel like it was hiding behind its design. It felt like it was being examined inside its own walls. The manager cleared his throat lightly. "The review will determine final outcome," he said. Keanu nodded. "I understand," he replied. And then he added, quietly but clearly. "But the process is already the outcome you needed to examine." That sentence didn't provoke a response. It didn't need one. Because everyone in the room understood it. The system had already revealed itself. And now it was only deciding how honestly it would document what it had shown. The elevator doors closed behind the executive quietly, but the atmosphere it left behind did not reset. It lingered. Like a decision that had already been made in principle, even if paperwork still needed to catch up. Inside the lobby, the receptionist kept her eyes on the screen longer than necessary, as if verifying that reality would remain stable if she continued to stare at it. Lines of internal notes were still open. Status fields still visible. Audit trails now active in ways they had not been before. The manager stood slightly to the side of the desk, no longer occupying the space with authority, but with caution. The shift was subtle, but noticeable. He was no longer directing the environment. He was reacting to it. Keanu remained in the same position. Still calm. Still composed. Still holding the folder that had started all of this, now looking less like an application and more like a record of how quickly perception can shape treatment. The receptionist finally spoke, softly. "It's fully under review now," she said. Not as reassurance. As confirmation. Keanu nodded once. "Good," he replied. No emotion added to it. No victory implied. Just acknowledgement that the process had been forced back into alignment with its own stated structure. A silence followed again, but this time it felt different. Earlier silence had been used to avoid truth. Now silence existed because truth had already been exposed and there was nothing left to disguise. The manager adjusted his posture slightly. "We will need to revise internal intake training after this," he said carefully. Keanu looked at him for a moment. Then replied, "Only if you actually see what happened." The manager didn't answer immediately. Because the sentence was not about policy. It was about awareness. The receptionist finally turned away from the screen, her shoulders lowering slightly as if some invisible tension had loosened. She looked at Keanu, then quickly looked down again, conflicted between professionalism and something more personal she didn't have a place to express. "I didn't think," she started, then stopped. She corrected herself quietly. "I didn't read it fully at first." Keanu's expression softened slightly, not approval, not dismissal, just recognition. "I know," he said simply. That was all. No punishment placed on her. No blame extended beyond where it belonged. That distinction mattered more than anything else in the room. The manager cleared his throat again, but the sound lacked the control it had earlier. "There will be a formal correction notice issued regarding the initial decline," he said. Keanu nodded. "That's appropriate," he replied. Then added, after a short pause. "But what matters more is whether the next person gets treated differently." That sentence changed the room more than any executive instruction had. Because it removed the focus from him. And placed it on repetition. The receptionist swallowed and looked back at the system logs again, her fingers hovering but not typing this time. She wasn't working anymore. She was absorbing. The manager exhaled slowly. "We can implement revised screening sensitivity guidelines," he said. Keanu looked at him. And replied, "Or you can stop calling people risks before you understand them." The manager didn't respond. Because this time, there was no procedural language that could comfortably contain the meaning. A resident passed through the lobby again, slower this time. He looked toward the reception desk, then toward Keanu, then away. But the curiosity remained visible in his hesitation. The building was no longer invisible. It was observable. And that was a different kind of exposure. Keanu finally shifted his weight slightly, not signaling departure yet, but acknowledging that the process was moving toward completion rather than continuation. The receptionist spoke again, quietly. "The review will take some time," she said. Keanu nodded. "I expected that," he replied. Then he added. "I'm not waiting for speed. I'm waiting for accuracy." That distinction landed quietly. But firmly. The manager glanced at him again, studying him not as an applicant anymore, but as a reference point for something the building had not fully understood about itself until now. Respect had not entered the room because of status. It had entered because of consistency. Keanu had not changed his tone once. Not when rejected. Not when corrected. Not when acknowledged. That consistency was now what made the system feel unstable in comparison. The receptionist finally closed one of the internal tabs on the screen. Not because she was told to. But because she no longer needed to stare at the mistake to understand it existed. The manager spoke one final time in a lower tone. "If the review confirms misapplication of criteria," he said, "we will issue formal correction and policy revision." Keanu nodded. "That's the baseline," he said. Then added, quietly. "Not the exception." A pause followed. This time, no one rushed to fill it. Because there was nothing left to argue that would improve the clarity of what had already been revealed. Keanu finally looked toward the entrance again. The glass doors reflected the city outside, movement, noise, unpredictability. Everything this building tried to filter out. He turned slightly back toward the desk. Not to prolong the moment. But to close it properly. "I didn't come here to prove anything," he said. "I came here to see how you decide."